The massive golden gates of the Al-Fahad estate loomed in the evening light, a symbol of wealth and untouchable power. Inside, the grand marble floors reflected the glow of an opulent chandelier, casting long shadows across the lavish interior. Amina moved swiftly, balancing a silver tray with delicate tea cups, her heart pounding in her chest. One wrong move, and she knew it would be over. She had only been working at the estate for 3 weeks, a poor African girl trying to survive in a world where she didn't belong. Every day was a battle, dodging the icy stares of the rich, the whispered insults from the other maids, and the relentless pressure to be perfect. But nothing could have prepared her for this moment. As she turned the corner into Kamal Al-Fahad's private suite, the tray in her hands slipped. Porcelain shattered. Hot tea spilled onto the pristine white carpet. A chilling silence filled the room. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, and froze. Standing before her, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his dark eyes burning with cold fury, was Kamal Al-Fahad, the Arab billionaire who owned this world. His jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists at his side. "Who," he said in a low, lethal voice, "let you in here?" Amina's breath caught. She had no answer, only the terrifying realization that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Amina's hands trembled as she dropped to her knees, desperately trying to clean up the mess. The shattered porcelain cut into her fingers, but she barely felt it. Her heart was pounding too hard. Kamal stepped forward, his polished shoes stopping inches from the spilled tea. His presence alone felt suffocating. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice like ice, controlled but deadly. I was just delivering the tea, sir," Amina stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Kamal's cold stare lingered on her for a moment, then drifted to the ruined carpet. His jaw ticked. "You're fired." The words hit her like a slap. Amina's head snapped up. "Please, sir." "I don't repeat myself," Kamal cut her off, his voice unwavering. Tears stung her eyes. This job was all she had. Without it, she wouldn't be able to pay for her little brother's hospital bills. She bowed her head, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Just give me one more chance. I swear I won't make another mistake." Kamal didn't respond immediately. His dark eyes narrowed, studying her. Something about the way she looked at him, so desperate, yet refusing to break completely, made him hesitate. He never hesitated. "Why do you need this job so badly?" His voice was softer now, but still distant. Amina clenched her fists, her breathing unsteady. "Because I have someone who depends on me. If I lose this job, She trailed off, shaking her head. Kamal's jaw tightened. This was none of his concern. And yet, for some inexplicable reason, he found himself unwilling to dismiss her so easily. He turned away, his voice sharp once more. "Get out of my sight. I'll decide what to do with you later." Amina exhaled a shaky breath, quickly gathering the broken pieces and rushing out before he could change his mind. But as she fled, Kamal stood rooted in place, a strange unease settling in his chest. He had no idea why he hadn't fired her immediately. And that unsettled him more than anything. Amina spent the rest of the day on edge, expecting to be called into the manager's office at any moment. Every time the kitchen doors swung open, her breath caught in her throat. By the time her shift ended, she still hadn't received any news. Maybe Kamal had forgotten about her. Maybe she was safe. But just as she was untying her apron, a voice stopped her. "You're coming with me." Amina spun around, eyes widening as she saw 2 tall men in black suits standing at the back exit. Kamal's bodyguards. Her stomach twisted with fear. What do you mean? Mr. Kamal has made a decision about your future, one of the men said. Amina's heart pounded. This was it. She was about to be dragged out, fired in the most humiliating way possible. Maybe even blacklisted from ever working in Dubai again. But instead of leading her outside, the guards escorted her into the back of a sleek black Rolls-Royce, shutting the door behind her. Her breathing was ragged as the car began moving. Where are you taking me? She asked, her voice shaking. To see Mr. Kamal, the driver responded without looking at her. Amina gripped her hands together, forcing herself to stay calm. Why would Kamal want to see her personally? After what felt like an eternity, the car pulled up in front of a massive skyscraper, its golden lights gleaming against the night sky. The moment she stepped out, she felt out of place, like a poor girl trespassing in a world she didn't belong to. Before she could turn back, a glass elevator whisked her upward, straight to the penthouse suite. The doors slid open, revealing a breathtaking panoramic view of Dubai's skyline. But Amina barely had time to take it in. Because standing in the middle of the room, hands in his pockets, was Kamal Al-Fahad. His dark eyes locked onto her as he spoke. You spilled tea on me today, he said, his voice smooth and unreadable. Amina swallowed hard. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I don't care about the tea, Kamal interrupted, stepping closer. I care about loyalty. And I need someone who knows how to follow orders. Amina's pulse raced. I don't understand. Kamal studied her for a moment, then smirked. You work for me now. Amina's breath caught in her throat. Did she hear him correctly? Work for him? I already have a job, she stammered. Kamal's smirk didn't fade. Not anymore. Amina's stomach twisted. Sir, Your manager has already been informed. You've been promoted. Her mind spun. Promoted? How? Why? Kamal turned, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window, hands still tucked into his pockets. From this moment on, you will be my personal assistant. You will be available when I need you, follow my instructions, and, most importantly, you will never question me. Amina's chest tightened. Why me? Kamal glanced over his shoulder, his gaze sharp. Because you're desperate, and desperate people make the most loyal employees. Amina flinched. He wasn't wrong. She needed money. Needed stability. But this was insane. I don't know if I'm qualified, she admitted. You're not, Kamal said, turning fully to face her. But you will be. Amina hesitated. This wasn't just any job. Working for a man like Kamal Al-Fahad meant stepping into a world of power, danger, and ruthless ambition. A world she didn't belong to. I need time to think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kamal's expression hardened. You don't have time. You either accept now, or you leave, and never step foot in this building again. Amina's heart pounded. She looked around the luxurious penthouse, then back at Kamal. His face was unreadable, but there was something lurking in his gaze, something dangerous. If she walked away, she would return to her tiny apartment, drowning in bills, struggling for every meal. But if she said yes, she didn't know what would happen. Amina took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then, against all logic, she lifted her chin and met his gaze. I'll do it. Kamal's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. Good. But as he stepped closer, his voice dropped to a chilling whisper. Don't make me regret it. The morning air in Dubai was crisp as Amina stood in front of the Al-Fahad Group headquarters, a towering glass skyscraper that seemed to scrape the heavens. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her simple black dress, the only professional-looking outfit she owned. What had she gotten herself into? The security team at the entrance barely spared her a glance before waving her inside. It was clear, they already knew who she was. Inside, the lobby was pure opulence. Marble floors gleamed under the golden lights, the scent of expensive cologne filled the air, and sharply dressed employees moved with a sense of purpose and urgency. She barely had time to take it all in before a tall woman in a sleek grey suit approached her. You must be Amina, the woman said, eyeing her critically. I'm Layla, Mr. Al-Fahad's chief of staff. Follow me. Amina nodded quickly, adjusting her bag on her shoulder as she hurried to keep up. Layla didn't slow down. Mr. Al-Fahad has a full schedule today. Your job is to shadow him, anticipate his needs, and most importantly, stay out of his way unless he calls for you. Anticipate his needs? What did that even mean? They reached a private elevator, and Layla swiped a gold access card before turning to Amina. One more thing, as she said, voice lowering. He has no patience for mistakes. If you can't keep up, you won't last here. Amina swallowed hard as the doors slid open. The top floor was nothing like the cold professionalism below. It was a lavish executive suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the office in golden sunlight. The air smelled of leather and rich Arabian oud, a scent so intoxicating it nearly made her dizzy. And then she saw him. Kamal stood by his desk, a vision of controlled power, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, the keffiyeh draped over his shoulders making him look like a king surveying his empire. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his dark eyes locked onto hers, sharp, assessing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he broke the silence. You're late. Amina's breath hitched. Her first day had just begun, and she was already in trouble. Amina's heart pounded as Kamal's sharp gaze pierced through her. You're late, he repeated, voice calm but laced with authority. I was told to arrive at 8, as she stammered, her throat dry. Kamal glanced at his luxury watch, then back at her. It's 8:02. Amina swallowed. 2 minutes. She was being scolded for 2 minutes? Layla, standing beside her, barely hid her smirk. I did warn you, didn't I? Kamal exhaled, rubbing his temple as if she were already a burden. Layla, give her the schedule. Layla handed Amina a thick leather-bound planner. This contains Mr. Al-Fahad's daily itinerary. Learn it. Memorize it. Anticipate what he needs before he asks. Amina clutched the planner, flipping through the pages. Meetings, investor calls, personal training sessions, dinner reservations. I don't have time for incompetence, Kamal continued, adjusting his cuffs. If you can't keep up, leave now. Amina clenched her jaw. No. She wouldn't let him intimidate her. I'll do my job, sir, as she said firmly, lifting her chin. Kamal raised a brow, as if amused by her sudden determination. We'll see. The intercom buzzed. Sir, Mr. Laurent from France is on line 1. Kamal gave her a pointed look. What time was the call scheduled? Amina's eyes darted to the planner, her fingers trembling as she flipped the page. 8:15 a.m. It's scheduled for... Too slow, Kamal cut her off, walking past her toward his desk. Heat rose to Amina's cheeks. This was a test. He wanted her to fail. Layla whispered beside her, a lesson number 1. He doesn't like to repeat himself. Amina pressed her lips together. She had underestimated this job. It wasn't just assisting a CEO, it was surviving a battlefield. And if she wanted to keep this job, she had to learn fast. Amina barely had time to breathe before Kamal's deep voice cut through the room. Cancel my lunch with Al-Rashid. Reschedule for Thursday. And make sure my flight to Geneva is confirmed for Friday. Amina's pulse raced. She flipped through the planner, scanning the appointments. Lunch with Al-Rashid was scheduled at an exclusive Dubai restaurant. Sir, should I inform Al-Rashid's secretary or reach out to him directly? Ishi asked, trying to maintain her composure. Kamal's eyes flicked up. For a brief second, something unreadable passed over his expression. Then, he simply said, figure it out. Amina clenched her teeth. Of course. No instructions. No help. Just survive. She grabbed the office landline, her fingers flying over the buttons. She didn't just call the secretary. She emailed a formal request, sent a follow-up message, and even texted Al-Rashid's assistant to ensure the message was received. Within minutes, the reply came, confirmed. Rescheduled for Thursday. Amina exhaled. One task down. But there was no time to celebrate. And my Geneva flight? Kamal asked, not even looking up from his screen. Amina checked the itinerary. Private jet, Friday 10 a.m. She quickly called the airline's concierge service, confirming the flight status and ensuring the crew was prepped. Your flight is confirmed, sir, Ishi responded, voice steady. Silence. Kamal finally lifted his gaze, studying her like she was an unexpected variable in his perfectly calculated world. Layla, who had been watching smugly from the corner, frowned slightly. Amina knew what that look meant. She had passed, for now. Kamal leaned back in his chair, adjusting the gold cufflink on his sleeve. Not bad for your first day. Amina didn't allow herself to smile. This was only the beginning. And something told her that working under Kamal Al-Fahad would be far more dangerous than she ever imagined. Amina was beginning to think she had a grip on this job, until she made her first mistake. It happened fast. Too fast. She had been reviewing Kamal's afternoon schedule when an unexpected call came through. A Swiss banker from Zurich, someone high-profile and discreet, had requested an urgent meeting. Amina hesitated. Kamal's schedule was packed. She knew how unpredictable he could be, but this seemed important. Without consulting him, she pushed back his next meeting by 30 minutes and squeezed in the banker's request. She thought she was being efficient. She thought she was proving herself. She thought wrong. The moment Kamal walked into his office, she knew something was off. His jaw was tight. His movements, precise but sharp, like a blade slicing through silk. Amina, he said, his voice dangerously low. Her hands went cold. Yes, sir? His piercing hazel eyes locked onto her, unreadable but lethal. Did you reschedule my meeting with Hassan Darzi? Amina swallowed. Yes, sir. There was an urgent request from. Did I ask you to? He cut in. The air in the office froze. Amina's pulse hammered in her throat. No, but I thought. Kamal exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The quiet disappointment in his voice was far worse. I don't pay you to think, Miss Diallo, he murmured, each word slow and deliberate. Amina's stomach twisted. She had worked for difficult bosses before. But Kamal Al-Fahad? He was different. Calculated. Unforgiving. Her throat tightened. I was only trying to. I don't care what you were trying to do. His eyes darkened, sharp as a dagger. You don't make decisions for me. Ever. The finality in his tone made her legs weak. I understand, sir, as she whispered, fighting the humiliation rising in her chest. He didn't reply. Instead, he simply turned away, as if she were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And just like that, she realized. She had one foot out the door. One more mistake, and Kamal wouldn't just fire her, he'd erase her. But Amina wasn't about to let that happen. She would prove herself. She would survive. And most of all, she would figure out why a man like Kamal Al-Fahad seemed so impossible to please. Amina left Kamal's office with her heart pounding in her ears. The humiliation still burned in her chest, but she forced herself to stay composed. She would not let him see her crumble. As she walked through the sleek marble hallways of Al-Fahad Enterprises, she caught glimpses of employees whispering behind her back. They had heard. Of course, they had. Kamal's reprimands were rare, but when they happened, they spread like wildfire. She clenched her fists, refusing to let the stares break her. She had to be smarter. Stronger. She needed to figure out what kind of man Kamal truly was. Because if she understood him, maybe she could survive him. Later that evening, as Amina packed up her desk, a familiar voice stopped her. Amina. She turned to see Laith, Kamal's right-hand man, standing beside her. Tall, broad-shouldered, and intimidating in his own right, Laith rarely spoke to anyone outside of Kamal's inner circle. She straightened. Yes? He studied her, his expression unreadable. I heard what happened today. Amina's jaw tightened. It was a misunderstanding. Laith gave a small, knowing smirk. That's what they all say. She frowned. Excuse me? He leaned against the desk, lowering his voice. You're new, so I'll give you some advice. Don't ever assume you understand Kamal Al-Fahad. Amina's pulse quickened. Laith continued, his tone edged with warning. He's not just your boss, Amina. He's a man who controls everything around him. The second you step out of line, you become a problem. And Kamal doesn't tolerate problems. A shiver ran down her spine. She knew Kamal was powerful. Ruthless. But the way Laith spoke, it felt like a warning of something much darker. She swallowed. Are you saying I should quit? Laither's lips curved slightly. I'm saying, be careful. Amina held his gaze. I can handle myself. Laith chuckled, pushing off the desk. We'll see. And with that, he disappeared down the hall, leaving Amina standing there, her mind racing. What had she just gotten herself into? That night, Amina lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of her tiny one-bedroom apartment. She had worked hard to get this job. She had endured worse. She wouldn't back down now. If Kamal Al-Fahad wanted perfection, she would become perfection. If he wanted her to stay silent, she would read his every move before he even made it. And if he wanted her to fear him, she would make sure she was the one thing he never saw coming. A threat. The next morning, Amina stepped into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. She would be careful. She would be smart. But she would not run. She made it through most of the day without incident, until an email landed in her inbox. From Kamal Al-Fahad. Subject: Private dinner, attendance required. Her heart skipped a beat. A private dinner? With him? She reread the message twice, her stomach twisting. What was this? A trap? A test? Or something much more dangerous? That evening, Amina found herself in front of one of Dubai's most exclusive restaurants. It wasn't a place for casual meals. It was a sanctuary for the elite. She took a deep breath, adjusting the modest yet elegant dress she had borrowed from a friend. She stepped inside. The restaurant oozed opulence, golden chandeliers, velvet drapes, soft candlelight. At the very center, at a secluded table, sat Kamal Al-Fahad. His black suit was flawless, his presence commanding. He looked up as she approached, his dark gaze locking onto hers. Amina, he said smoothly. Right on time. She sat across from him, her back straight. You didn't give me much of a choice. He smirked. No, I didn't. A waiter arrived, pouring them both a deep red wine. Amina hesitated. Why am I here? Kamal swirled his glass, studying her. You intrigue me, he admitted. Most people crumble after one of my reprimands. But you walked away more determined. Amina met his gaze without flinching. I don't scare easily. Kamal chuckled, taking a slow sip of his wine. Good, he murmured. Because I hate cowards. The dinner was a game of words. Kamal tested her, throwing calculated jabs, watching her every reaction. But Amina held her ground, matching his wit with her own. She refused to be intimidated. Until he leaned closer, his voice dropping into something dangerously smooth. I could destroy you, Amina. Her breath caught. His expression was unreadable. One word from me, and your career, your entire future, would be nothing but a memory. Amina's fingers curled into fists beneath the table. She should be terrified. But instead, she felt something else. A challenge. Lifting her chin, she met his stare with unwavering confidence. You could, she admitted. But then you'd lose the only person in your company who's willing to tell you the truth. Silence. For the first time, Kamal looked surprised. Then, slowly, a smile curved his lips. You're bold, he murmured, amusement flickering in his eyes. Amina forced herself to breathe, her pulse racing. Had she just made a mistake? Or had she just stepped into a dangerous game, one she wasn't sure she could win? Amina's heart pounded as she watched Kamal smirk, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Very few people dare to challenge me, Amina, he said, swirling the wine in his glass. I find it refreshing. She forced herself to hold his gaze. I'm not here to entertain you, Mr. Al-Fahad. His smirk deepened. No, you're here because I told you to be. A sharp retort sat on her tongue, but she swallowed it. She couldn't afford to let her emotions show, not in front of him. The tension between them crackled like an unspoken challenge. Then Kamal leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Work for me directly. Amina's breath caught. What? I want you as my personal executive assistant. His tone was smooth, calculated. Close to me. Handling things no one else can. Amina frowned, suspicion creeping in. Why me? Kamal studied her, his sharp eyes piercing. Because I need someone who won't back down. Her fingers clenched around the napkin in her lap. She had fought so hard to avoid being under his control, and now he was offering her a position that would tie her even closer to him. This was a test. A trap. And yet, it was also an opportunity. She could say no, walk away, and avoid the power struggle that was brewing between them. Or she could step closer, play his game, and change her life forever. Amina took a slow breath. What's in it for me? Kamal's eyes flashed with amusement. I'll double your salary. Her pulse skipped. Money like that could change everything for her and her family back home. But was it worth the risk? She lifted her chin. I'll think about it. Kamal's smirk widened. Take your time. But they both knew this wasn't an offer she could refuse. That night, as Amina lay awake in her tiny apartment, she replayed the dinner in her mind. Kamal was playing a game. And if she stepped into it, there was no turning back. She thought of her mother, struggling back home. The bills. The debts. The sacrifices she had made to get here. She had come to Dubai for a better life. And now, the door to that life was open. All she had to do was step through it. At dawn, she made her decision. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed out her response. To Kamal Al-Fahad. Subject: your offer. I accept. She hit send. And with that, she sealed her fate. Amina stood outside Kamal Al-Fahad's towering corporate building, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. She had spent the night debating her decision, questioning her sanity, but in the end, the choice had been clear. She needed this. Not just for herself, but for her family. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The receptionist, a tall, elegant woman with sharp eyes, barely spared her a glance before gesturing toward the private elevator. Mr. Al-Fahad is expecting you. Amina's heels clicked against the marble floors as she stepped inside, the door sliding shut behind her. She exhaled, trying to steady her nerves. Stay calm. Stay professional. Do not let him intimidate you. The doors opened to reveal a sleek, minimalist office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And there he was. Kamal Al-Fahad. Seated behind a massive glass desk, he looked up, his dark eyes locking onto her. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then, "You're late." Amina's brows shot up. "I'm exactly on time." Kamal leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering across his face. A smart assistant would be early. She squared her shoulders. A smart boss would set clear expectations. Silence. Then, a slow smirk spread across his lips. "I see." He stood, moving toward her with a predator's grace. "I was right about you." Amina forced herself to hold her ground. "I'm here to work, Mr. Al-Fahad. Not to play games." Kamal's smirk didn't fade. "Oh, Amina." His voice was silk and steel. "This entire world is a game. The question is, are you ready to play?" Amina expected to spend her first day buried in paperwork. She was wrong. Kamal wasted no time throwing her into the fire. Her first task? Fixing a $1 million deal that his previous assistant had nearly ruined. She barely had time to process before she was ushered into a high-stakes meeting, where powerful executives stared her down, waiting for her to crumble. She could feel Kamal watching her, testing her. But Amina wasn't about to fail. Summoning every ounce of courage, she straightened her back and spoke. And by the end of the meeting, she had saved the deal. The moment they stepped out, Kamal turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You surprise me." Amina met his gaze. "You underestimated me." His lips twitched. Perhaps. For the first time, something other than amusement flickered in his eyes. Something dangerous. Something intense. And just like that, she knew. This was only the beginning. Word spread fast. By lunchtime, the entire office was buzzing about how the new assistant had saved $1 million deal on her first day. Some were impressed. Others? Not so much. Amina felt the weight of the stares as she walked through the halls. Some curious, some indifferent, and some openly hostile. Especially from Lena. Lena, Kamal's former assistant, the one she unknowingly replaced. She was beautiful, poised, and carried herself like she owned the building. And judging by the way she eyed Amina, she was not pleased. So, Lena leaned against Amina's desk, fake smile in place. "You must think you're special, ho?" Amina barely looked up. "Excuse me?" "You're not the first girl Kamal has brought into his office." Lena's voice was sweet, but her eyes burned with resentment. "And trust me, you won't be the last." Amina's fingers tightened around her pen, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm here to work, Lena," as she said evenly. "Whatever history you have with him is none of my business." Lena let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, you really have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." With that, she walked away, leaving Amina with a sinking feeling in her chest. What did she mean? And why did it feel like she had just stepped into a battlefield? Later that evening, Amina found herself in Kamal's office, going over reports. He sat across from her, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, a picture of effortless power. But something was different tonight. The usual sharpness in his eyes was softer. "Tired?" she asked before she could stop herself. Kamal glanced at her, surprised. "Are you worried about me, Miss Amina?" She rolled her eyes. "I just don't want my boss passing out from exhaustion. It'd be inconvenient." A chuckle rumbled from his chest. "Noted." Then, suddenly, the power went out. The office was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the city skyline. Amina stiffened. "What just?" Before she could finish, she felt him. Standing close. Too close. She turned, only to find Kamal inches away. In the dim light, his features looked even sharper, his presence even more overwhelming. His voice dropped, low and intense. "You're not afraid of the dark, are you?" Amina swallowed hard. "No." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Good." The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something dangerous. Then, the power flickered back on. And just like that, Kamal stepped away, back to his desk, as if nothing had happened. But Amina knew. Something had shifted. And there was no going back. The night after the power outage in Kamal's office, Amina struggled to sleep. Her mind replayed everything, the way his eyes had locked onto hers in the dark, the tension so thick it was suffocating. But she couldn't dwell on it. She had bigger problems. Because earlier that evening, she got a call she never wanted to receive. Her older brother, Malik. Amina, we need money. His voice was sharp, urgent. Mama's health is getting worse. Amina's stomach twisted. I sent everything I had last month. It's not enough. Malik snapped. Then he sighed. Look, I know you have a rich boss. Just ask him for an advance. Her grip on the phone tightened. I can't just ask Kamal Al-Fahad for money, Malik. That's not how it works. Then make it work. The line went dead. Amina sat on her bed, feeling the weight of it all crash down on her. Her mother's hospital bills. Her brother's expectations. And now, whatever was happening with Kamal. She took a shaky breath. She had to figure this out. The next morning, Amina entered Kamal's office to find him in a mood. Cold. Distant. He barely looked at her, his responses short and clipped. Had she done something wrong? Kamal, is everything all right? As she asked hesitantly. He finally looked up, his dark eyes unreadable. It's Mr. Al-Fahad to you, Miss Amina. Let's keep things professional. The words hit her like a slap. Professional? After everything? Her jaw clenched. Understood, Mr. Al-Fahad. She turned on her heel and walked out, fighting the sting in her chest. But as she left, she didn't see the way Kamal watched her go, his expression tight, his fists clenched. Because pushing her away was the only way to stop himself from falling for her. Amina paced outside the Grand Al-Fahad Tower, her heart hammering in her chest. Her mother's hospital bills were overdue. Malik's words rang in her ears. Just ask your rich boss for an advance. But how could she? Kamal had already pushed her away, treating her like just another employee. Yet, she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she marched back into the building and up to his office. She knocked once before stepping inside. Kamal looked up, his eyes briefly softening before turning cold again. Amina. What do you need? She swallowed hard. I need an advance on my salary. Silence. His sharp gaze studied her. For what? His tone was unreadable. She hesitated. It's personal. Kamal leaned back, steepling his fingers. That's not how business works, Amina. Her nails dug into her palm. I'll work overtime. I'll do anything. Please. For the first time, a flicker of concern crossed his face. Then, he exhaled sharply. How much do you need? She hesitated, embarrassed. $5,000. Kamal's brow lifted slightly. That was nothing to him. But the fact that she was desperate enough to ask meant something. He reached into his drawer, pulled out a check, and scribbled the amount. As he handed it to her, his fingers brushed hers. I expect you to repay this. Amina looked into his eyes, something unreadable passing between them. I will. She turned and left, but Kamal remained still, staring at the door. Why did it bother him so much to see her like this? Later that evening, Kamal sat in his private lounge, sipping his whiskey. The door opened, and an older man in a tailored suit stepped inside. His father, Sheikh Abdul Al-Fahad. I hear you've taken a liking to your new assistant, the Sheikh said, his voice laced with disapproval. Kamal tensed. She's just an employee. His father chuckled. That's not what the staff is saying. Kamal's grip on his glass tightened. Listen to me, son, The sheikh continued. We are Al-Fayads. We don't mix with people beneath our status. Especially not some poor African girl. Kamal's jaw clenched. She's more than that. His father sighed. This is how your mother started, with a poor maid. And look how that ended. Kamal's blood ran cold. His father stepped closer. End this, before it's too late. The door shut behind him, leaving Kamal alone with his thoughts. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had no control. Amina clutched the check tightly as she walked into the hospital. Her mother lay weak in bed, her frail hand gripping Amina's as she whispered, You're working too hard, my love. Amina forced a smile. Everything will be fine, Mama. But deep inside, she felt hollow. She had to beg for this money. And worse, Kamal had given it to her like a transaction. Just another business deal. She had to remind herself, he wasn't her friend. And he definitely wasn't her savior. Later that night, Amina sat in her tiny apartment when her brother, Malik, barged in. His eyes lit up when he saw the check. So, the billionaire finally paid up? Amina frowned. It's a loan, Malik. I have to pay it back. Malik scoffed. Or you could do something smarter. Amina tensed. What are you talking about? Malik leaned in. You're close to him. He trusts you. Do you know how much money flows through his accounts every day? Amina's stomach twisted. Stop, Malik. But he continued, his voice low and dangerous. One transfer. One small amount, and we're set for life. Amina shot up from her chair. I would never steal from him. Malik smirked. Then stay poor. But don't forget, Amina, loyalty won't feed Mamar. His words haunted her long after he was gone. Would Kamal still trust her if he knew what her own brother was planning? And why did she care so much about what Kamal thought? In his penthouse, Kamal stood by the window, staring at the city skyline. His father's words still echoed in his mind. We don't mix with people beneath our status. But Amina wasn't just anyone. He had tried to push her away. He had been cruel, cold, distant. And yet, she still occupied his thoughts. Why? Why did he feel an ache in his chest when he saw the sadness in her eyes? Why did he feel rage at the idea of anyone else helping her but him? Kamal downed his drink and made a decision. This had to stop. Whatever this was between them, he would end it, even if it killed him. Amina couldn't sleep. Malik's words echoed in her mind. Loyalty won't feed Mamar. But betraying Kamal? That was out of the question. She grabbed her phone and typed a message. Amina, I'll repay your money as soon as I can. But after that, I don't want anything from you, Kamal. She hesitated for a moment before hitting send. A few seconds later, her phone buzzed. Kamal, what are you talking about? Amina, I don't want to be your charity case. No response. But she knew he'd seen it. She sighed, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Maybe now, she could finally move on. The next evening, Amina finished her shift at the restaurant, exhausted. As she stepped outside, a sleek black car pulled up in front of her. Before she could react, the door opened. And Kamal stepped out. Her heart stopped. He looked furious. And devastatingly handsome in his tailored suit. Amina took a cautious step back. What are you doing here? Kamal's jaw clenched. Get in. She crossed her arms. No. His eyes darkened. Amina. She swallowed hard. I meant what I said. I'll pay you back, and then we're done. Kamal took a slow step toward her, towering over her. Is that what you really want? His voice was low, dangerous. Amina's breath hitched. Yes. No. She didn't know anymore. He searched her face, then suddenly grabbed her wrist. Not harshly. Not forcefully. But with a desperation that scared her more than anything. You don't get to walk away from me so easily, Amina. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had never seen Kamal like this. Vulnerable. Possessive. Like a man who was fighting a battle with himself, and losing. Amina's pulse thundered as Kamal opened the car door, waiting for her to get in. She hesitated. Everything in her screamed that stepping into this car was a mistake. But the way he looked at her, intense, unrelenting, made it impossible to refuse. Silently, she slid into the passenger seat. The door shut with a quiet click, sealing her fate. Kamal walked around, got in, and started the engine. Neither of them spoke as the car pulled into the streets of Dubai, the neon lights reflecting in the windshield. The silence was thick, charged with unspoken words. Amina clenched her hands in her lap. Where are we going? Kamal's grip tightened on the wheel. Somewhere we can talk. His tone sent a shiver down her spine. Not because she feared him, but because she feared herself. Feared what she'd say. What she'd admit if he pushed hard enough. Minutes later, Kamal led her to the rooftop of an exclusive high-rise overlooking the Dubai skyline. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the ocean. Amina hugged herself, staring at the endless city lights. I don't understand you, as she murmured. One minute you're cold, the next you act like. She trailed off, unsure how to finish. Kamal turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Like what? Amina swallowed. Like you, Car. Silence. Then, in a voice so low it sent chills through her, he said, I do. Amina's breath caught. Kamal stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. I care more than I should. She looked up, trapped in his gaze. But that doesn't change the fact that we're from two different worlds, Kamal. He reached out, slowly, giving her time to move away. She didn't. His fingers brushed against her cheek, warm against her cool skin. Then let me destroy those worlds, he whispered. Amina's heart skipped a beat. Was she willing to let him? Or was this dangerous game about to consume them both? Amina's breath hitched as Kamal's fingers lingered on her cheek. His touch was warm, sending a dangerous shiver down her spine. She wanted to pull away. But she couldn't. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held her captive. Amina, his voice was softer now, laced with something that made her pulse race. She forced herself to step back, breaking the spell. This isn't right, as she whispered. Kamal's jaw tightened. Why? You're an Arab executive from one of the wealthiest families in Dubai. And I'm just. His hand caught her wrist, stopping her words. You are not just anything, he said, his voice edged with frustration. Amina swallowed hard. He made her feel seen, but that only made everything worse. This will end badly, Kamal. A smirk played at the corner of his lips. Then let it. Her heart pounded. If she let him in, there would be no turning back. Unbeknownst to them, a pair of eyes watched from the shadows. Layla. Kamal's family had already planned for him to marry her, a match made in wealth and power. But now, he was falling for a waitress, a nobody in their world. Her nails dug into her palms as she watched Amina and Kamal from a distance. This girl has no idea what she's playing with, Layla whispered to herself. She wouldn't let Amina win. She couldn't. Because in their world, love wasn't just about emotions. It was about control. And Layla refused to lose. Later that night, Amina sat in her small apartment, her mind racing. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? A distorted voice whispered. Stay away from him, or you'll regret it. A chill ran down Amina's spine. The call ended. She stared at the screen, her hands shaking. Was this just a warning? Or had she just stepped into something far more dangerous? Amina's hands trembled as she clutched her phone. The warning still echoed in her mind, a stay away from him, or you'll regret it. But who sent it? Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to walk away before it was too late. But another part of her, the part that had already given her heart to Kamal, refused to back down. She needed answers. Determined, she grabbed her bag and headed straight to Kamal's office. Kamal looked up in surprise as Amina stormed into his office. Amina? He stood up, concern etched across his face. What's wrong? She threw her phone onto his desk. This. He picked it up, reading the unknown message. His expression darkened. Who sent this? She demanded. His jaw clenched. I don't know, but I will find out. She crossed her arms. Kamal, someone is warning me to stay away from you. And I have a feeling this isn't just some empty threat. His dark eyes burned with intensity. I won't let anyone hurt you, he said, stepping closer. Amina shook her head. That's not enough. You need to tell me the truth. Who doesn't want us together? Kamal hesitated. He had spent his life shielding her from the darker side of his world, but the time for secrecy was over. He exhaled sharply. Layla. Amina's stomach dropped. She's my family's chosen fiancé, Kamal admitted. But I never agreed to it. Amina took a step back, her heart pounding. So she sees me as a threat. Kamal grabbed her hands. Amina, I don't care about Layla. I care about you. But your family does, as she shot back. And if Layla is capable of threatening me like this, what else is she willing to do? Silence. Kamal's grip on her hands tightened. I will handle this. Amina's chest ached. She wanted to believe him. But something told her. This was only the beginning. Layla stood on the balcony of her penthouse, gazing at the city lights of Dubai. A slow smirk curved her lips as she tapped her manicured nails against her wine glass. If Amina thought a mere warning would be enough to scare her off, she was wrong. She had far more powerful ways to remove obstacles. Reaching for her phone, she dialed a number. A deep male voice answered. Do it, Layla said coldly. The man chuckled. Consider it done. As she ended the call, she whispered to herself. Let's see how strong their love really is. Amina walked through the quiet Dubai street, her thoughts heavy. Kamal had promised to protect her, but how could he fight an enemy he couldn't see? She checked her phone. No messages from him. She sighed, stepping forward. Then a black car screeched to a stop beside her. Her heart pounded. Before she could react, two men in dark suits stepped out. Amina Hassan, one of them asked, his voice sharp. She turned to run. Too late. A cloth covered her mouth. A sickly sweet scent filled her nose. Her vision blurred. The last thing she saw was the Dubai skyline before darkness swallowed her whole. Kamal's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Who is this? A cold chuckle. Your little waitress is with us, the voice sneered. Kamal's blood ran cold. Where is she? A sinister pause. You want her back? Stay away from Layla. Then, click. Kamal threw his phone against the wall. His security team rushed in. Sir? His voice was ice. Find her. Now. His worst fear had come true. They took Amina. And if they hurt her, there would be no mercy. Amina's head throbbed as she woke up. She was tied to a chair. A dimly lit warehouse. Empty. Silent. Then, footsteps. A figure stepped forward. Layla. Amina's heart clenched. You. Layla smirked, crossing her arms. Surprised? Amina glared. Why are you doing this? Layla crouched down, her voice like venom. Because you don't belong in his world. Amina clenched her fists. He loves me. Layla's eyes darkened. Slap. The sting burned Amina's cheek. I decide who he loves, Layla hissed. She leaned closer, whispering. If you want to live, leave him. Forever. Amina's breath hitched. She had two choices. Break Kamal's heart. Or never see the light of day again. Kamal paced his penthouse, fists clenched, his mind racing. Amina was in danger. His security team had tracked the call, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Dubai. His bodyguards stood ready, armed, waiting for his command. His right-hand man, Omar, spoke urgently. Sir, we should call the authorities. Kamal's voice was ice-cold. No. This is personal. Without another word, he stormed out, his men following. He would burn the city down before he let anyone hurt Amina. Amina's hands were tied, but her spirit wasn't broken. She stared at Layla, her voice steady. I will never leave Kamal. Layla's expression twisted in rage. You stupid girl. She grabbed Amina's face, nails digging into her skin. You think love will protect you? Kamal will never find you in time. Amina refused to show fear. Kamal would come. He would find her. And Layla would regret everything. Layla exhaled sharply. Fine. Have it your way. She gestured to the two masked men behind her. Make her disappear. The men stepped forward. Then, boom. The warehouse doors exploded open. Gunshots rang out. Layla gasped as Kamal's security team stormed in. Kamal was at the front, his eyes burning with pure fury. Let her go. The men hesitated. But Kamal didn't. With lightning speed, he lunged, taking them down with brutal precision. Layla tried to run. Omar grabbed her, twisting her arm behind her back. She screamed. Kamal rushed to Amina, his hands shaking as he untied her. Amina? She looked up at him, then collapsed into his arms. He held her tight, breathing her in. She was safe. And Layla? She would pay. Deeply. Layla struggled against Omai's grip, but it was useless. Kamal's eyes were dark with rage as he towered over her. You made a mistake, Layla, he said coldly. She sneered. You think this is over, Kamal? He leaned in, his voice deadly. Oh, it's over. For you. He turned to his men. Take her away. Layla screamed as she was dragged off, her reign of manipulation shattered. She had lost. Amina sat on the hospital bed, wrapped in a soft blanket. Kamal sat beside her, his usual sharpness replaced with concern. You're safe now, he whispered. Amina smiled weakly. I knew you'd come. He exhaled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I almost lost you. She took his hand. I'm still here, Kamal. Something shifted in his gaze. A realization. He couldn't lose her. Ever. Days passed. Layla had disappeared, her influence erased. Kamal stood on his balcony, staring at the Dubai skyline. Amina walked up behind him. What's on your mind? She asked. He turned, his expression serious yet filled with something new. Peace. I want you by my side, Amina. Forever. Her heart pounded. Are you saying? He took her hands. I'm saying I love you. Tears welled in her eyes. Kamal. He pulled her close, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that sealed everything. The past, the pain, it all led to this moment. And now, their future was just beginning. As the city lights glittered behind them, Kamal and Amina held each other. Two souls from different worlds, bound by fate. Their story was no longer about revenge or status. It was about love. And this was only the beginning.